today's key session, Lessons from the East. Southeast Asia, after the European Union, is considered as the most connected region in the world. The region, which is booming with economic growth and prosperity, can unfold some valuable lessons for Nepal, which in terms of consumer behavior, adaptability, and outlook resembles countries in Southeast Asia rather than South Asia. What learnings can Nepal derive from a region that has benefited from substantial connectivity? Ladies and gentlemen, to discuss on these topics and to carry forward the session, I'd like to invite our moderator for this key session, Mr. Sujeev Shakya on stage, founder and CEO, Bead Management. I'd also like to invite our speakers on stage, Ms. Gwen Robinson, Editor-at-Large, Nikkei Asia Review, Ms. Neeta Pokhrel, Unit Head, Project Administration, South Asia Urban and Water Division, ADB Manila, and Mr. Valentino S. Bagatsing, President and CEO at Investment and Capital Corporation of the Philippines, ICCP. So ladies and gentlemen, with this stage all set, with our moderator and panelists all ready to see what lessons East can we
try to take the discussions ahead from there and look at lessons from the East. And when we were trying to curate this session, we thought that how do we look at lessons from the East? And we said, who should be in the panel? And now we have today, on my extreme right, Gwen Robinson with Nikkei Asia Review, has worked in this region for long enough. And Neeta from Nepal, in Australia, and now in Manila. She brings her own perspectives. And of course, there's Val, who did spend 4 years in Nepal and back again to share his own perspectives. So without much ado, the way the session is going to work is that we have 60 minutes for this session. And that will include about 15 minutes of Q&A and interactions from the floor. As Sadiksha was mentioning, please do download the app. We are going to take questions only from the app. And there's a way you can just ask a question so that we can have more questions coming from the floor. With that, I would like to start from Gwen. And maybe you could share, where does, you connect from lessons from the East, and coming from the East, what you do, and what are your opening remarks?
Thanks very much, Sujeev, and hello, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here and hear the outstanding previous talks, which actually said a lot of things that I think we all want to say. So forgive us if there's a bit of repetition. I just will very briefly tell you about my involvement in the region. I've been reporting, writing and researching Asia with a focus on Southeast and North Asia for some decades, actually. And about 6 years ago, I joined the Nikkei, which is Japan's premier financial economic news organization. There was a feeling in Nikkei that despite efforts to have an English language publication, and that has been going for some decades, there was a feeling that the region really needed some high-quality journal digest of regional affairs largely by Asians for Asians. So after 20 years with the Financial Times as a correspondent and editor, I joined Nikkei to launch the Nikkei Asian Review, which is a website and weekly magazine just dedicated to Asia. And we mean Asia in the broadest sense of the word. So that was launched about 5-6 years ago. And about 18 months later, Nikkei decided to buy the Financial Times. So now the Japanese own the Financial Times, which is where I worked for many years. And I think it has become a perfect convergence of both Western expertise and Asian reporting and editing talents. And that's where and how I've been covering and watching the region for the last 5 years. So I'll give you some
Thank you.
thoughts later on that.
Thank you, Gwen. So, Neeta, your opening remarks, and where do you come from?
Thank you, Sujeev. As Gwen says, it's an honor to be here. For me, it's also a great privilege because I come home. I work with Asian Development Bank. I manage the portfolio of Urban and Water Division in SARD, South Asia Regional Department of ADB. As Sujeev mentioned, I live in the Philippines, have been doing so for 7 years. I travel a lot. South Asia is what we cover. But in Southeast Asia, as I am based there, and also we interact a lot with our colleagues who work there. And as a tourist, I travel around Southeast Asia because it's just in the heart of it. For me, and I'm an engineer, we hear a lot of very right remarks. Our predecessors, previous speakers talked about connectivity is not just infrastructure. And I fully agree, but maybe I'm a little bit biased because I'm an engineer. But you still can't give water through Wi-Fi yet. You have to dig and put pipes. And you still have to build railways. And we watch, it is actually South Asia, the reason I work, is the fastest growing economy, faster than Southeast. But we are least connected. So it's interesting for us to watch where have we lapsed, where do we build, how fast we build. We have to leapfrog. But then again, is it possible to leapfrog without the right infrastructure and the mindsets and the policies? So I will be, as I speak, drawing parallels to not just Southeast, South Asia continuously. So allow me to keep anchoring back to South Asia, please.
No, thanks. That's really great. Sort of the, alternating between Southeast Asia and South Asia. Val, your opening remarks.
Sure. Namaskar, everybody. Namaste. It's nice to be back. I see a lot of familiar faces here today. I've had 5 jobs when I worked in the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank, but not because I'm here, but the best years of my life were spent here in Kathmandu. So I had a lot of experiences, a lot of friends. I was also lucky enough to I signed the project development agreement for the Upper Trishuli, which is the largest FDI in Nepali for hydro with ADB. I'm happy to see it financially closed a couple of months ago. I was also, is Siddhant Pandey around? I was also the one who signed BO2, Business Oxygen, during my term. And also the first Marriott, with it, the Sheraton and the big Marriott followed after that, the one in Tamil. So it's nice to see the airport very bright. Before when I was coming in, it was so dark, I was tripping. But, so I've worked in Laos, I've worked in Nepal, and now I'm back in my country, the Philippines. I retired from the World Bank in May, so I started working again in September. But I think the session is very apt. Of course, I'm biased being Filipino. There's a lot of parallels between our two countries, which we can go into later. But more importantly, there's a lot of lessons, mistakes, successes, and what have yous that I think Nepal and all of us can learn from each other this afternoon.
Thanks. I'll just stick to you, Val. And we were discussing about the parallels between in Nepal and Philippines. Maybe just, a few thoughts on that. We'll start with that. And then, where do you see the parallels between, we are going to look east and, the parallels with Philippines?
I don't want to go into some sort of academic exercise, okay? Maybe the best parallel I can show you is everybody, please raise your hand whoever passed by Doha, Qatar, on your way here or elsewhere or anywhere in the Middle East. So what happens when you get off the plane during a layover at Doha? More often than not, if you're a VIP, you get somebody will take you, and usually they're Filipino.
Yeah.
Okay, by the time you get to the lounge, the guy serving you coffee is Nepali.
Yeah.
If you get sick, you trip, you go to the hospital in the Middle East, more often than not, your nurse is Filipino. And then the orderly is Nepali.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there.
Sure. Thanks. So that's a commonality we are trying to weave and to see that how we connect to this session. And maybe I'll go with Gwen. And sitting in this region, sitting in Bangkok and traveling around Asia, where do you see the whole story of connectivity emerging? We'll talk about the challenges later, but what have you been seeing in the past, couple of years and the past decade in terms of how Southeast Asia internally is connecting?
Well, speaking as someone who lives and works in Bangkok for a decade, but travelling throughout Asia, but with a particular focus on the region, I can say 10 years ago when I moved to Bangkok, the word connectivity was just coming up in ASEAN circles, and it was a big theme in 2011. And just tracking through these last 10 years, you can see it has just exploded in sort of a frenzy of infrastructure building funded through various ways. And I think it must be very tedious for people in a different region like we're sitting in now to be lectured or told by someone from Southeast Asia, oh, this is what Southeast Asians are doing and maybe Nepal and this region should look at that. But what's been very impressive is, Southeast Asian countries are not really known as being so collegiate. Everyone has their own agendas. Cambodia, Philippines, Thailand, very independent-minded. But the binding glue has been ASEAN and a lot of regional cooperation mechanisms. And I think what we've seen in the last 5 years is the rise of some call it the rise of minilateralism, a kind of breakdown of big organisations into smaller groupings, and particularly a division, I think, in Asia, Southeast Asia, of mainland and maritime Southeast Asia. So we've seen mainland Southeast Asia form, like the Greater Mekong sub-region has formed its own identity, really. 5 countries of the Greater Mekong sub-region. This is now giving rise to sort of a lot of connectivity projects and cooperation on cross-border, planning for everything from customs and dealing with duties and agreements that actually drive these projects forward to border towns, special economic zones, border crossing points, which when I first moved to the region, there was no way to cross into Myanmar from Thailand legally and drive a truck through. And now there are numerous border points. So I think that's been a very encouraging thing. I do have views on challenges, but we can come back to that.
We'll come back to the challenges. So, Neeta, you've been working in South Asia. You've been living and traveling in Southeast Asia. Where do you see this whole connectivity discourse, and what are the differences you see, and what are some of the commonalities you see around that?
Thank you, Sujeev. For me, the commonalities I see is drive towards decentralization. I say drive because nobody's got there yet. I think with us, we have a long way to go. And in South Asia, not just Nepal, India, I work mostly in India. India is ADB's largest client now. Nepal is pretty big also, but still India is the largest. They are struggling with decentralization. They started long back. And when you're trying to drive connectivity, you can't just have central powers doing the planning, central powers doing the pushing. It's not connectivity to just the economic corridors. It's internal connectivity, as our previous speakers talked about. And for that, you need local leadership, which we lack. Whereas I find that a lot higher in Southeast Asia. And not across other South Asian countries, but southern cities in India. I just came via Kolkata. I had to do loan reviews there. And of course, it's highly decentralized. So that local drive, decentralization, we are very much there to get. In terms of private, I see a lot of private sector colleagues here, which is great, entrepreneurs. Private sector funding into services and infrastructure. Private sector is doing great in Nepal, but nobody's putting a dime into infrastructure and running the services. Whereas we see a lot of that in Southeast Asia.
Okay.
So
I infrastructure is what is being driven.
Sorry, I'm biased.
Sorry.
I'm an engineer, but
okay.
Still, even for that, as I said, it's not just infrastructure, but decentralization, the local voices, rural underdevelopment in Nepal. Again, it has to rise from within and rise locally. That I see very strongly in Southeast Asia.
No, thanks. I think, so coming to you, talking about infrastructure, and which also means that infrastructure brings you to investments. And Val, you've been, part of a multilateral agency for long, and now you're, a part of an investment, sort of a bank. So where do you see, in terms of the money part, how much that does play a big role in terms of pushing connectivity, and what have been any anecdotal stories you have around? That'll be wonderful.
Well, I mean, trade flows have already been established here and in the region for centuries. Okay, capital flows is something that will drive that infrastructure that Neeta was talking about. I mean, Nepal of 5 years ago is different from Nepal of today, obviously. I mean, there's so much progress already done as far as the contractual foundations that will create that infrastructure to begin with. So now the key is the implementation, as usual. The devil is in the details. So, there are several aspects of the economy that can be prodded. Okay, now that is, of course, the government, as the Right Honorable said, you cannot look at the government all the time to save you, but it's not the saving that's really important, but the enabling. So it's just to create the atmosphere and my favorite quote from this, the late Mancur Olson, the Nobel Prize winner, there's only two things you need for a society to thrive. Okay, equal protection under the law, and you minimize predation. What does that mean? It means that the strong cannot keep taking advantage of the weak. So you equalize that, and then you will have a prosperous society.
Okay, I think, this is something that more of a personal interest to me, because I think in Nepal, if you look at, from the time you left Nepal, if you look at GDP of Nepal, it has grown. We have more budget allocations for infrastructure. We have more investments coming in from multilaterals, coming from bilaterals, DFIs. But, what is one thing, if you would say, what is it that Southeast Asia does differently than what we do in Nepal? And what could be that one thing we can learn from? We can just start with that.
I mean, the Southeast Asia is a very diverse 10 country. If you look at ASEAN itself, it's 10 countries. And you have a whole range, from a command economy like Vietnam to a freewheeling democracy like my country. So it's very, somewhere the magic secret sauce is in between.
Sure.
You cannot completely say, let's have a command economy, or you cannot say, let's have freewheeling democracy.
Sure.
So you have to adjust. So the important thing really that I can see is mistakes have to be encouraged quickly so that you can adjust.
Thank you.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I think
Gwen.
what Southeast Asia is doing really well, that, I'm amazed. I think that you've pointed this out in your books, Sujeev, and writings constantly, but I think what Southeast Asia has done really well is leverage location. Its location, collectively and also individually. So as I said, the coming together in the Mekong, but also getting their act together with ASEAN. And I'm amazed at Nepal's incredibly strategic location, and as you've written and everybody knows, the kind of bridge between India and China thing. And you don't get so much of the sense here as you do in Southeast Asia of the squeeze between China and the US. It's more here, China and India, I guess. But still, it strikes me that there's two things lacking here. One is not enough of leveraging the location and using that to get better deals and deal with, big powers. But secondly, cooperation within this region. And, I asked you about that earlier, and it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of, super connectivity and cooperation going on between Nepal and neighbouring countries. So maybe that's two things that could be learnt from Southeast Asia. I'm not saying Southeast Asia is perfect. I mean, they're all out for their own, own improvements.
I think, Gwen, since you have, we're discussing this, I just want you to, among the countries, I totally agree with you, Val, we are talking about 10 countries in Southeast Asia, but when we keep chatting about Myanmar, Burma, and what have you been seeing, over these couple of years? Because I think when we look at, again, at a personal interest, looking at fragile countries that become frontier investment destination, be it in Africa, be it in Latin America, or be it in East Asia. So where do you see some of the things that, as you're going to Myanmar, that you have found it very interesting that would be useful when we are talking about the connectivity discourse around in South Asia or in Nepal?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually I've been watching Myanmar particularly closely for the last 10 years. In fact, when I arrived at the region, Aung San Suu Kyi was still under house arrest and was just released at the end of 2010. And my first visit there in the modern era, I was there in the 80s, was just a broken, practically a failed state, that had had decades of ruinous military management or mismanagement. And I think in some ways Myanmar comes in for a lot of criticism because of human rights issues and other things. And now Aung San Suu Kyi's gone from hero to zero, but actually, if you look, the country has done extraordinarily well over the last, particularly 8 years, and is growing, and contrary to belief, has not taken such a big hit from the last couple of years. And what it's done really well, I'm returning again to this, but I think leveraging the location and getting its act together on the investment front, people will say, of course, it had the advantage of China's immense interest, and then the US moving in to try and... So it's become a little bit of a prize of sorts and a litmus test for big power rivalry in the region. So it is attracting a lot of funding, but I think they've played it quite smart, and especially trying to entice in the mid-levels of private investors. And we're not talking about the big US ones. These are smaller Asian investors, particularly Singaporeans and others.
No, yeah.
Sujeev,
Yeah.
I
Neeta.
want to add to that. Actually, in 2012, when the world started re-engaging and the development partners like ourselves and World Bank and others went in, I was part of a small team to do the urban strategy for Myanmar. And it just reminded me when Gwen talked about it. When we met the head of the urban ministry, he told our team, please don't tell me the successes that has happened in your urban sector interventions. I only want to know about the failures.
Wow.
So we ended up collating all the urban sector strategy failures and pitfalls and totally, this was for me, I've been working for 25 years in urban and water sector. A client saying, because everybody says best lessons learned, best, And so it was very refreshing for us. I know they're still struggling. Our Myanmar portfolio isn't doing great. But it was refreshing for a secretary of the ministry to say, I don't want to know successes. Tell me what didn't work.
Yeah, thanks, Neeta. So I'll just get back to you in terms of, we had Bruno and Raja Mohan talk a lot of the China part, and of course we heard from Andy also, but then, the China side is there, but you're working in India, and what are some of the things that are happening? Of course, that is South Asia, but what are some of the things that are happening at the grassroots or the, sort of the municipal level in India that also, is slightly different than what happens in Southeast Asia, and what is working? Because for us, whatever said and done, our learnings from South Asia is much more easier to manage because of the cultural aspects. So where do you are there some anecdotal stories you want to share?
Sure. I have been working in India since 2004, and I find it fascinating, again, because of the cultural similarities and closeness. The most striking for me is the capacity to be self-reliant, or the want to be self-reliant in designing, in planning, in implementing is much higher than here. I find even in Southeast Asia, they do central level. Many countries do central level planning, central level urban strategies. So I think India's got right. It's all, very few things are at federal. all state. Even within state, of course, the northern side hasn't got the decentralization drive. The south, the cities will tell you what they want. Development partners like us will be told, sometimes not in a very nice way. You want to play, you play there. This is what we need. That we see a lot more assertive in India than we do in Southeast Asia. So, and the capacity, again, I mean, I also worked directly in Nepal for 4 or 5 years. I was based here. I'm still working here. I've never left Nepal in my professional realm. And I always shake our colleagues here, all the ministries I work with, to say, what do you want? Don't let donors tell you what they want or what is right. And they still hesitate. You know, we have this innate, do we really know? And I also always say, look, we, in South Asia, Nepal included, we produce very high quality engineers. Give 5 years, they will stop reviewing any design or doing. They are so consultant reliant. That is a lot less now in India, that ability to plan, again, much more decentralized, drive, implement, design. So that is for me very, more so than in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is still quite centrally given, strategic, central strategies, then it cascades down to local level, which they do drive, but the other way is stronger in India, I find.
Okay, I think moving to Val, I think we just started, if you would like to comment on any of the, sort of what Neeta and Gwen is saying, and then I'll have a question for you after that.
I mean, when you talk of connectivity, you cannot not ignore the gorilla in the room that we will talk about tomorrow, which is climate. Okay, and the fact that urban and cities, they're the front lines. Okay, and they are the people that suffer the most. So if you will relate that to connectivity, then the fact that, there's a big capacity gap that occurs. That's why Neeta mentioned the engineer anecdote. So I'm very quite passionate about the STEM. I mean, both our countries are having this demographic dividend. Okay?
Yeah.
My country, median age is 24.4. Yours is
22.7.
22.7. We should not let that go. Okay, that is a golden opportunity. And that will only happen once every, 50, 100 years. After that, it's gone.
So do you see that the demographic dividends is something that countries in Southeast Asia did leverage? I think Philippines is one, but are there others you've been also seeing?
Remember, it's yin-yang, okay? There's a lot of monasteries here. It's a double-edged sword. If you don't take care of it, then you can have an Arab Spring. You'll have a lot of young people who will just rebel. So the important thing is to motivate them, to educate them, to connect them.
Okay, so let's, I think before we go into another, I think it's not to only paint a rosy picture and say what are the opportunities, what's happening, but as we were discussing earlier, as to some of the problems, and I think, what Neeta was sharing about, Myanmar talking about what are the problems, tell you a problem. So what are some of the challenges you see with South Asia as it's grown, you've been seeing? So Gwen, maybe I'll start with you and I'll come to Neeta and Val later.
Yes, well, I'm glad you raised that because one of my pet issues is, and where I think this region could really learn a lot from Southeast Asia's example. And again, I'm going to tell a little anecdote that is actually, again, with a Myanmar, a Burmese official early on when I was trying to do a piece on the opening up of Myanmar and the tourism potential. One of the top tourism officials said to me, we do not want to become another Cambodia. And, that really watch them roll out policies that, for example, immediately banned jet skis from beaches, instituted laws that you couldn't build more than one story along some of the most scenic beaches, those sort of things. And frankly, when you sit in Southeast Asia and go around some of the top resorts, you can see the impact of over-tourism and a lack of central policy and control and regulation of tourism centres. And when I interviewed in Indonesia, Jokowi, the year before last, one of his top initiatives he was speaking about, so enthusiastic, was he said, we want to build, 100 more Balis, meaning not Bali as it has become, but open up like remote regions of the country. So Indonesia, for example, is putting in money into building airports in remote locations, because if you want to develop remote locations, you've got to get people there. But they've got an eye on the lessons. And if you go to Cambodia and go to Sihanoukville, which I'm sure most people have heard about, there's nearly 80 Chinese casinos in Sihanoukville, and a lot of site of building collapses and things like that. But so I think the impact of over-tourism is a real lesson to be learnt here. But I must say, that said, I was really struck by the photos of, I think it went viral, of the queues waiting to get to the top of Everest. So that sort of seems to me a bit of over-tourism going around up there too.
No, I think that's a big challenge, because I think in our quest of getting into numbers, we have been, sort of really ignored the quality tourism part of it. And Cambodia is a great example of what perhaps not to do in terms of volume tourism, because tourism does bring in, people, connects places, but it does have its challenges, So that's a good point to look at. Yeah.
Can I just say very quickly too, I think most recently we've seen the Philippines take a hard decision to close down Boracay Island for a while, and the Thais are now closing quite a few sort of supposed secluded locations, which are now sort of completely flooded with tourists. So, they're closing them on a selective basis, and now Indonesia is considering closing Komodo Island. So these are all mainly temporary closures. Some places, I don't know what's happened to Boracay, but I think that's really instructive, that they're biting the bullet and maybe killing a bit of a golden goose, but in the end they've got their eye on a broader measure to act against this sort of over-tourism.
Just to reinforce and Nepal can also take good advantage of it, is you should train the young people for higher quality tourism. And if you have better, higher quality tourism, then they can, in fact, instead of being tourism officers or tourist guide, they can be, environmental guides.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, when we are talking about lessons from the East, Bhutan is east of Nepal. And just a day before, they announced that now even for the regional tourists, which we have to read as Indian tourists, now have to pay equivalent to about 1,200 Indian rupees as the development fees that earlier, which they charged to other countries. So that's what Bhutan has done to ensure that the number of tourists are coming, it's the pressure on tourism would be met. And I think again, it's in Africa, but a country I've been working for 8 years now, we've been working in Rwanda, is completely focused about quality tourism. Increase the prices, get the numbers down. And I think, because if you look at Nepal also, one of the things we see is with the services industry. And, tourism becomes one part of it. And now, as Val was saying, whether we focus on the high end and, low volume or high value, low value, high volume, that becomes a big challenge. Neeta, I think, we can move a bit away from tourism and look at what are some of the things that, your friends talk about Southeast Asia. And we were having this very interesting conversation. Maybe you want to share that.
Yeah, no, it was maybe pun earlier, my Southeast Asian colleague saying, really? South Asia colleagues want to learn from us? We tell them that they should learn from you. But no, on that positive note, I also constantly say to our colleagues, even in Philippines, Filipino colleagues, that some of the good practices, we have such community participation and willingness to pay, conscious habits to pay for it, not just operational costs, capital cost. Actually, Asian Development Bank, we've been supporting these small towns water supply schemes. We're covering 110 towns. I process one of these loans. We take this everywhere in Southeast Asia, South Asia. I'm sending people from Kolkata, from Tamil Nadu, from Andhra Pradesh to come and see and meet our colleagues here, go to villages. The Logani in roads.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, the way to organize it, I mean, we have, very powerful ADB, your bid, Kantipur, I mean.
We will fund lots of community.
Exactly.
We will fund lots of community-based schemes. Bring it to us, not just big melamchis. So we want more of those, absolutely.
Okay, I think I'm just looking at the clock in front of us, and I'm trying to see is that if we can get into some discussions around some of the big idea things that you've really been impressed with what's happened in the region, and to say that, wow, this is amazing, and this is, something that we can learn from. So we can just take a round of that, and then we can just start working with the audience. Yeah, Gwen?
Well, if we're talking big picture, I mean, do you think amazing good or amazing bad? Just amazing.
No, both. It could be either. It could be either.
I mean, to me, my biggest picture impression, or what has interested me in the last few years, is this rise of big power rivalry, and particularly in Southeast Asia, seeing these countries initially feeling squeezed, even beleaguered, being forced to choose sides between China's massive Belt and Road Initiative versus, the US increasing pressure to support the whole launch of this free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which actually is a bit oranges and apples, because it's like, China saying, we want to build you bridges and roads and you be part of BRI. And the US sort of exhorting free and open values and democracy in the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, and, don't go with those nasty Chinese, that sort of rhetoric, but no money. And in fact, now what's happened, I think, in the last 2 years is the US has really realised that this is that the battle has shifted. It's not just, there is a lot of attention on military and security issues as well, of course, and there's a mini arms race going on in Asia. But I think the big picture now, and the US gets it, is that the battleground is about infrastructure development financing, all that. So while you're talking about community-based things, I think the definition of community has changed a lot, and also these new funding models are coming in under these broad sweeping concepts. And now we've got the US launching or relaunching its Development Finance Corporation, which used to be OPIC, and offering all kinds of models to the region, including private sector involvement and funding, but with a big push from the government to pay for costs, maybe pay for insurance, project insurance, things like that. So I think that's a very big development in the region, where from a glass half full, a lot of these Southeast Asian states are now thinking, hey, we are I think who used the term, it's a seller's market. So I think that was probably Bruno or maybe Rajan. But that's what it is, and they're now feeling much more empowered to pick and choose. And I think that's very interesting, and that's what I meant about this region, and sort of wanting to see Nepal and others sort of use that leverage.
Yeah, I think I love your phrase seller's market, because in Nepal we are debating whether to take $500 million of free money from MCC. We are debating, what China is going to do and what India is going to do. We are living in a seller's market for sure.
Free and money are oxymorons. There's no such thing as free money. Okay, I remind everybody.
Okay, Neeta, what's the big one thing you would like to talk about in the region you've seen, and which really impresses you, that you say, wow, this is something amazing? Anything that you would like to share? Any big picture stuff?
As I said, for me, the assertion that is coming from down below, decentralized bodies that we don't see here, but everywhere else I see. Make in India, the assertion to say our way, follow our rules, no MDB rules. I buy that. We need to know we are in the fastest growing 6 above. There was an earthquake. Look how quickly we bounced back and still got 7% growth. Yeah, so we need to know ourselves. It's the mindfulness. We are strong. We are strategic. We are in between. We are the balancing force here. Let's say this is what we need. And again, same. This drives Make in India, and also now not just India, Bangladesh, many Southeast Asian countries are incentivizing local governance reforms. You do X reforms, we'll give you Y money. Make them compete. We've just federalized. You've got mayors now finally after 20 years. Yeah. Let's make mayors compete with reforms and say, you do Y and 3 reforms, we'll give you $3 million. Yeah. So that is for me something we could emulate, and it inspires me every time.
Val, one big idea.
Well, big picture. I remember the same ballroom, 2014. I was lucky enough to organize an event, and I didn't realize it was the first time that the power secretaries of Nepal, Bangladesh, India, and Bhutan were in the same stage. Just the connectivity, the transmission line between India and Nepal, maybe Bangladesh can get some of that power because it passes by there anyway, which is tremendous in itself.
No, thanks. I think.
And it's not only electricity, it can be fiber optic, and then you have the youth, you can take advantage of them, services industry, STEM, digital. There's so much you can do.
Thanks. So we are going to start off with the questions coming from the stage, so from the audience, sorry. Before I would just go into, I'm so tempted because I don't want to miss the opportunity of Gwen being here, and you interviewed the Bangladesh Prime Minister, and some of the thoughts you're having. We had this conversation on Bangladesh, and where do you see, and what are some of those 1 or 2 points you want to talk about, because that's also a lesson that Nepal can learn from as to what Bangladesh is doing right.
Right. Oh, wow, I didn't expect to talk about Bangladesh, but I must say, I'd heard a lot about Bangladesh, but when I went there to interview Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and look at the economy, I was greatly humbled. I had no idea how much the country had come forward from let's say from the 70s, when it was virtually a broken, razed and failed state. And now, I think what's been extraordinary is just facts like, the drive for food self-sufficiency, the ability to feed and at least hold together a population of like nearly 170 million people in what is basically a low-lying near swampland. And on top of that, the influx of Rohingya refugees now that has settled the country with more than 1 million refugees on the border. And it has developed a garment industry that has gone from sort of virtually nothing to become the number 2 in the world, a place it's kept for some years now. And now what I see is the rise of the digital economy in Bangladesh. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that here from what I've read you've written as well about that, Sujeev. A lot of young, bright people. So again, demographic dividend. Maybe they're mining that more effectively than Southeast Asians, although Southeast Asia is becoming an aging society. And Thailand, incredibly, in 20 years has swung from being a young society to not as aging as Japan. So I think Bangladesh has many things going for it and everything going against it. Climate, lack of land, sort of ethnic and religious divisions, religious extremism, pretty nasty politics, and somehow it's muddled on, and it has grown consistently above 6% for many years actually, and this year's still on target for maybe hitting 8%. So I think that's pretty amazing.
No,
I think we can learn a lot from it.
Thanks, Gwen, because I think I've been also looking at Bangladesh, and of course, tomorrow morning we have a keynote speaker from Bangladesh, the founder of Patao, is going to be there talking about, a company
yes,
that...
our Bangladesh speaker is a perfect,
so
perfect
tomorrow
symbol
we'll...
of the new
But I
Bangladesh.
just, thought to take some perspectives from you. So we have a couple of questions, so please do when you're sending your questions. So I'm online here, and please do mention who do you want to ask the question. So, but I think I've got one question, maybe Val, you want to take this to say that, what do you think location can be leveraged to attract more investment in South Asia? That's from Abhilasha Ramaji. So.
Well, I just mentioned the connectivity in electricity. Again, the service orientation of the country should be leveraged, okay? So, I mean, there are potential, I'm not familiar with the healthcare industry in India, but definitely in China, maybe Andy can, let us know there's an aging population in Europe, and some China, Japan, obviously. So that's definitely an opportunity, I mean, some people frown on migration and the diaspora, but listen, folks, that's a permanent situation. My country, 12% of our population is overseas. 10 to 12% of, I just found out 18% of all the nurses in California are Filipino.
Wow.
Wow. What does that tell you?
You're taken care of and loved.
There's still a lot of nurses in my country. So, you form schools. I was just talking to a friend of mine with a school last night. And we have a lot of Nepali dentist students. There's a lot of Indian dentist students. You can have more schools here, build more schools.
Okay, I'm just looking at the questions. So I think I'll take a couple of them together, and maybe we can just do a round and also move on to your closing thoughts. To say that there's from Sadiq Shastrashta. They says, learn from others' mistakes. However, in certain circumstances, one thing that doesn't work for someone or for one region might work for someone else or another region. Any thoughts you have on that? That's an interesting question. So you could get the question. So basically, in certain circumstances, one thing that doesn't work for someone or one region might work here, work for someone. Is there something that you would want to, anyone if you want to take this? Something that doesn't work somewhere else can work here. Neeta?
I talked about this Myanmar urban secretary telling us to look at failures. So you never look, again, what worked for others, you have to overlay it over your own circumstances. What didn't work for others, you do the same. But what didn't work for the set of others, are we closer to that? Are we, socio-political, all different contexts. So I think for both what worked for others, what didn't work for others, but you have to overlay it like a GIS layer with your own set of parameters and indicators, and as we've all talked about, take the strengths up out of it to say this is what we can leverage on. This makes us vulnerable because we've seen others failing with it. We are similar on these indices, and we have to drop that.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I just think one thing is that, and this is probably not a popular thing to say considering my two other panelists, but I think there was an old view. It still exists in some circles in the big development organisations, institutions, which is one size fits all. So, we've all known some of the well-known examples of restructuring efforts. For example, Indonesia went horribly wrong because the World Bank and IMF got it wrong there. And they've got it wrong in certain other places. There is no one-size-fits-all, and there is some policymakers, and I'm not just blaming, IFIs, but others do try and apply. It worked here, why can't it work there? So I think that's a very good question, and I'd say one key example is tax reform, where, different countries, it should be so tailored to an individual country's economics and demographics, and yet, there are big advisors, institutions that try and advice, the same formulas?
So we have another question. I think it's more, I'm just trying to paraphrase the question in terms of the audience to understand. So this is from Kusum Tamang. And basically any example, because in Nepal, I think when we talk about development or changes, we rely a lot on the development partners and the multilateral and bilateral worlds, because we don't think of much on the private sector world part of it. So are there any examples any one of you want to take up where we look at corporate social responsibility or anything that has, not-for-profits that have done that we can take as lessons that we can take in Nepal? Any interesting CSR stuff or anything that not-for-profits has done in the Southeast? In the role of development.
But in any region of Asia, Asia?
In Southeast Asia, yeah.
Oh, Southeast Asia.
Yeah, that we could learn from. Yeah. Anything that is, exemplary, not-for-profit corporate social responsibility work, that's the question that has come.
Well, so not-for-profit versus corporate social responsibility, CSR is really big companies. Yeah. Not-for-profit.
Yeah, and any examples of good CSR efforts that have been made that we can talk about? That's a question. If you don't have an answer, that's fine.
Val's been dealing with big companies for years, haven't you?
Well, I mean, let's see. You see, the mere word corporate social responsibility, honestly, that one is, I think it's fading. Okay, companies now are realizing that being socially responsible is a matter of survival. It's no longer some cute let's plant a tree, risk management now with the extreme events in the world are becoming more a risk management tool. So it's no longer a feel-good thing. It's either everybody feels good, I can't feel good alone.
But I think it's still very important for companies. If I may say, can
Sure.
I give a key example, I think,
Sure.
is that Thailand, as people might be aware, Thailand was at the forefront of EU complaints on fishing industry for a variety of reasons and practices in the fishing industry. And the biggest Thai company in fisheries is, without a doubt, Thai Union. It was called Thai Union Frozen. And it actually owns things like John West Tuna, Chicken of the Sea. It's a mega company worldwide, huge, with vast fishing fleets, etc., and was getting so hit and criticised. And it implemented some very big CSR initiatives. And finally, I think last year, stunningly, Greenpeace and World Wildlife Fund turned around and actually issued statements in support of how this company had completely restructured its policies, its fishing practices, its recruitment, labour, etc. So I'm not saying they're perfect, but I think that's really a stunning example of a Thai company that's actually multinational, global, and has managed to turn itself around in the name of. But I agree with Val. I think corporate social responsibility covers a multitude of sins.
I just remembered the transaction I did last October before I left IFC in Manila. In the beginning, all of these small farmers are getting affected by typhoons. We get a lot of typhoons in the Philippines. So what we did is we linked up with some insurance companies. At first, they didn't want to touch that because it's small. It's like 1-2 hectare property. They need 10,000, 15,000. That's about $300, the average size of a farmer's plot. But we asked them, listen, we'll give you a grant. You do an actuarial study of where the typhoon hits, and then let's demographically make it diverse so that you can risk it. And true enough, they came up with a formula where a farmer pays 20 pesos is about 40 US cents a month to cover his $300 plot of land. It might be small for us, but for them, it's devastating. And true enough, in the last typhoon, we had 10,000 farmers who benefited. The insurance company, whom we helped create the infrastructure to have that kind of delivery system, made a small profit, but they made more profit in the advertising, saying, here we are helping the small farmers. You can trust us. So that self-interest is still the big motivator.
Neeta, you had something to
Very quick example. Last year, I was preparing a loan for Rajasthan for 42 cities, and Coke came to see me. in Philippines. And again, I used to be what you call ESD manager in my private sector days in Australia, Ecological Sustainable Development Manager. And I was very cynical to say, I'm just making your annual report look good. And so I told Coke, this is CSR, what you want us to work with us. He said, no, ma'am, it is survival. Because in Rajasthan, there is a huge water security issue with climate change. If they're not responsible in 10 years, we will not get water to mine and make coke. So as Val says, it's not CSR, it's matter of survival that private sector have to do. So that was one example.
Okay. So I think, we are coming to the close. So, I mean, just final 60 seconds, any closing remarks you would like to make? Neeta, you want to start? Gwen? Put it on the spot.
Well, all I can say, being a first-timer in this particular region, I can see so many similarities, but I can also see the disparities and as you say, what this region can learn from Southeast Asia. But I'm actually getting ideas about what Southeast Asia could learn from here as well. And these are both positive and negative. So I think this is something that I'll take back with me and maybe try and, incorporate in future coverage.
Thanks.
For me, I'm also a diehard optimist like you. I see with ADB, we've been supporting this program called SASIC, Southeast Asia Sub-Regional Cooperation. I see a lot of good. We had this operational plan where the government we want to focus in trade reforms, custom reforms, connectivity. We are investing in building Pokhrel Mugling to connect there. We've got corridors happening going up to Myanmar through India. Again, I see a lot of good it's all going in the right direction. But in terms of, again, for me, it's decentralization, decentralization, decentralization. Empowerment, letting people tell you what you need rather than development partners telling you what you need.
Thanks. Val?
Oh, I mean, it's a great homecoming for me. 4 years, I left here 2016, so 4 years, a lot has changed. And it's nice to see Nepal progressing. I think you should take advantage of your, location. You have the demographics. You just don't be afraid to make the mistakes. Just push on.
No, thank you. This has been great to have this panel. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Neeta. Thank you, Val. And I don't want to summarize this discussion, but I think there's a lot of lessons to learn. And I think from a positive, as lessons, we also need to look at what are the mistakes others have made, and we should also learn from this mistake. Thank you all for coming for this session, and a round of applause to our panelists. And back to Sadiq.